I have to say, the Shaman talents aren't making me feel very confident with what Blizzard might do for paladins when they finally release the first iteration of the paladin trees. Which they did after I wrote this script but before I got around to recording it. Particularly, the Shaman class tree is making me feel that way. The fact that there are 4 root talents and 3 capstone talents isn't in and of itself a problem, not really. But what I really don't like is how just about everything in their class tree is totems, totems, and more totems. I mean, really. There's Capacitor Totem, Tremor Totem, Earth Grab Totem, Wind Rush Totem, Totemic Projection, Healing Stream Totem, Totemic Focus, Call of the Elements, Poison Cleansing Totem. Really, Blizzard? Mana Spring Totem, Tranquil Air Totem, and Stone Skin Totem. That is 12 different abilities that either are or directly deal with totems. Totems are basically blessings and auras rolled into one, minus the mobility that each of blessings and auras allow. Honestly, they're not all that interesting. Damage abilities, things that go boom, are interesting. And it feels like Blizzard kind of lost sight of that when they were designing the Shaman class talents. It's not that any one of these totems is a terrible idea, though Poison Cleansing Totem feels kind of out of place with today's debuffing environment. It's more like there are too many of them, and Blizzard should probably baseline as many of these totems as they can get away with, and replace them with more interesting direct damage or healing abilities, possibly taken from the class trees, which have a lot of those. I mean, when I was putting together my ideal paladin talents, I unpruned the Holy Wrath spell specifically so that I would have a damage ability to use as Protection's capstone talent in the class tree. Sure, Protection has gotten along without Holy Wrath just fine for the past few expansions, but that just means Holy Wrath isn't a must-have, and that it would instead be a fun supplement, either for Protection or for Retribution, or even for a soloing Holy Spec. And I made sure Holy Wrath contrasted with the single-target Capstone Retribution talent in the class tree, which was an earlier version of Execution Sentence. Those are the kind of things you want as Capstone talents, not defensive cooldowns like Tranquil Air or Stone Skin, or a buff to a cooldown reset for totems. This is making me wonder if, when they release the Paladin talents, they'll end up putting a lot of blessings and auras in the class talents. On the one hand, it's better to put that kind of thing into the class talents, but on the other hand, the class talents need some direct damage and healing abilities to keep them interesting, and there aren't enough of either of those in the Shaman class talents. And then there's the fact that Enhancement doesn't exactly have a section or a path in it, the way Blood, Unholy, or Frost do for Death Knights. Of course, the Death Knight paths are far, far too restrictive, something Blizzard themselves have acknowledged, and it's one of the reasons why I haven't done Death Knights in one of these videos yet. And the one good thing about the Shaman class tree is that it's got a lot of freedom in it. And a lot of places where you can jog left or right, and some places where you have to, as a matter of fact. Honestly, if it were up to me, here's what I would do with the class talents. I'd baseline Chain Lightning, Frost Shock, and Astral Shift, and I'd baseline about half of the totems. I'd make Maelstrom Weapon a baseline passive you get for free for picking Enhancement, since there's not really much use case at all for Maelstrom Weapon for Elemental or Restoration. I would pull Lava Burst to the middle. I would make it the root Elemental combat talent, and then I'd take either Feral Spirit or Crash Lightning out of the Enhancement tree and make one of those the root Enhancement talent on the right. I'd take Primordial Wave out of all the Spec talent trees, put it in an octagon at the deepest part of the Elemental column, and make it a pick one octagon talent alongside Chain Harvest. Then I'd probably put Elemental Blast as the capstone enhancement talent in the class tree, though I'd make it easily accessible from talents that Elemental would be getting anyways. I had thought about putting Ascendance over on the right as a capstone talent. It's appealing enough to be a capstone talent, and since all 3 specs have Ascendance as a talent, it kind of makes sense to put it in the class tree. But really, Ascendance and the Covenant abilities should be equally accessible to all 3 specs, which is why I think I can get away with having Primordial Wave and Chain Harvest as the Elemental capstone, since it's right in the middle in this version. If I could find a way to have the dead center column talents be appealing for Restoration, I could see maybe 4 capstone talents instead of 3 in the class tree. One of the 2 middle ones being Ascendance and the other one being Chain Harvest and Primordial Wave together in an octagon. I would also pick some passives that would work for enhancement and put them down the right-hand side, so enhancement has an actual path in the class tree. Flurry would be an optional talent, since it only really works for crit specs, and it might be the enhancement spec tree that would be a better place for it, instead of the class tree. Thunderstorm would probably be between elemental and enhancement, and I might pull some other talents out of the spec trees into the class tree, like Downpour or Liquid Magma Totem, to make things interesting. Yeah, I did start this video by poo-pooing having too many totems in the class tree, but at least Liquid Magma Totem is direct damage. Obviously, I wouldn't want to go too far with taking interesting stuff out of the spec trees. They need interesting stuff to be interesting, after all. There's also some CC and mobility tools in the class tree. I'd probably put a mix of those in between the paths. I'm not 100% sure whether Crash Lightning or Feral Spirit is the wiser option for what to have as the root enhancement talent. Feral Spirit is really iconic, but I don't want either one of these to turn out to be a must-have talent for Elemental or Restoration. I'm just a little worried that Feral Spirit would be a must-have talent for Elemental no matter what I do, since it's a damage cooldown, so I'm leaning in the direction of making Crash Lightning so that it's not that great when you first get it, at least not that great from an Elemental or Restoration perspective. But if you take a few talents deeper down in the enhancement column, Crash Lightning will become worth casting as Elemental or Restoration in multi-target scenarios. Probably it would need to power up Chain Lightning or something like that, if you took those talents. That's about all my thoughts on the class tree. Honestly, though, the spec talents look mostly good with a few exceptions. Elemental Combat has overall rhyme and reason insofar as most of the talents on the right-hand side are about fire damage and most of the ones on the left-hand side are about nature damage. I'm a bit surprised they put a defensive talent on the right-hand side, though. They basically made it a must-have for Elemental Combat to pick at least one defensive talent, either Primordial Bond or Refreshing Waters. Now, it's not that I don't think talents that go off the beaten path or work towards a role that your spec doesn't specialize in are a bad idea. They're not. I pine for the return of the Denounce spell, often, if you watch just about any of my other videos, and while I'd like Denounce to be in the Paladin class tree, I'd be okay with it in the Holy Spec tree as well. But I would not want Denounce to be a prerequisite for any talents that are must-haves for healing. The Priest's Holy Tree had this same problem with Guardian Spirit having both Holy Fire and Holy Word Chastise as prerequisites. Again, it's not a bad thing that those talents are in the Holy Priest tree at all, but they shouldn't be prerequisites for Holy Priests to get Guardian Spirit. Just like these defensive talents shouldn't be prerequisites for must-have procs like Lava Surge. These kinds of things should be optional, off-to-the-side talents that a player can take or skip at will. That is player freedom, and it's what we need to see for the talents to really be fun for players. About my only other complaint, again, this is from an outsider's perspective, is that Earth and Rage isn't in the tree. I loved seeing those slabs of stone come up out of the ground and launch themselves away at enemies. It looked like a really cool separate ability, even though it's really just a passive at the end of the day. But it's a cool passive, an aesthetically pleasing and very flavorful passive. And it's right up the alley of the left-hand side of the Elemental Combat tree, so I really hope Earth and Rage makes it in a later version. Enhancement doesn't have the overall rhyme and reason the Elemental Combat tree has, and is a little bit more like the Priest's Shadow tree in that it's got some mini-paths that have themes to them. That's okay. Overall, if you want to spec yourself for single target damage, you can, and if you want to spec yourself for multi-target damage, you can. Although, Hot Hand and Primal Primers look redundant. I guess that's the kind of thing you're going to see in trees that Blizzard has been rushing to get in front of players. While it's a little bit sad that there aren't big damage buttons as capstone talents, the capstone's talents build upon appealing active abilities deep in the tree, so I feel like that's not really a cause to complain. Overall, the enhancement tree seems pretty decent, with a few tweaks and fixes needed here and there, as any alpha tree would need. Now, Restoration is, in my opinion, an example of off-spec talents done right. There are some damage talents way over on the left that aren't really exclusive prerequisites for any must-have healing talents like the Defensive Octagon was for Lava Surge for Elemental. They also feed into each other. Personally, I think the version of Lava Surge Restoration has ought to be over there with those other talents, along with Master of the Elements for that matter. Though the positioning of Lava Surge and Master of the Elements isn't bad, insofar as both of them are quite skippable. I mean, the only talent downstream of Lava Surge is Spirit Lake Totem, and there's two other paths that lead into Spirit Lake Totem. And the talents that are under Master of the Elements are Manatide Totem and Torrent, and there are other paths that'll lead you into those. It might be a little more convenient if all the damage talents were grouped together, but it's not necessary per se, and each of those 4 damage talents is an example of off-spec talent placement done correctly. But as far as rhyme and reason go, for a little while I was going to say there was more emphasis on multi-target healing on the left, but then I saw there was quite a bit of multi-target healing on the right, especially Healing Stream Totem on Tier 2. What is that doing on Tier 2 of the Restoration Spec Tree when it's already on Tier 7 of the Class Tree? Honestly. I would think the best place for Healing Stream Totem would be shallow in the class talents in Restoration's column, where Elemental or Enhancement could easily pick it up if they wanted to mix in a little support healing in their kits. Healing Stream Totem is the perfect spell for that kind of thing, so it should be inexpensive and easy to pick up in the class tree instead of deep in the class tree or shallow in the spec tree. Obviously, the redundancy here, which is even worse than Hot Hand and Primal Primers, honestly, is another sign that Blizzard is rushing to get these trees in front of us. And that's a good thing if they're doing it to pivot based on the feedback we give them. Though I hope so much that they have lots and lots of open and honest and frequent and detailed communication, and that they very visibly pivot based on feedback. Otherwise, all of this rushing will have been for nothing. Anyhow, the Restoration Spec Tree looks fairly solid overall. There's great freedom, really easy to zig and zag, which I would not want to lose in future iterations. If there were a little more rhyme and reason to the placement of the talents, maybe multi-target heals grouped on the left and single target on the right, then maybe that would be a little bit better. But overall, Restoration's got pretty good design to it. Again, I feel like the class tree needs quite a bit more work than the spec trees do. None of them are perfect, and you should be taking what I say with a healthy grain of salt as an outsider's perspective, since I don't really play a shaman myself. I figure I'm probably missing something as a result of that, but I also figured I'd throw my 2 cents out there just the same.